Listen to the Carolina Storyteller Podcast, a campfire-style storytelling podcast focusing on ghost stories, legends, and true crime. Available now wherever you listen to podcasts.
Welcome to Ouch! Was That a Ghost? This podcast may contain graphic material, which some listeners may find disturbing. Listener discretion is advised.
Help me.
Now that we covered that, here's your host, Liz.
Welcome back to Ouch! Was That a Ghost? Cannibalism, by definition, is consuming another individual of the same species. Is there a point of desperation where it's considered acceptable? And what if you're not sure if the person was desperate enough? Today I'm covering another request, the Colorado Cannibal, whose infamy lives on today. Alferd. Throughout the story, I will be referring to him as Alferd and Alfred, because I've seen Alfred on his birth certificate and Alferd throughout. Or vice versa. Either way, he was known by both. So Alferd Packer was born on January 21st, 1842 in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, which happened to be unincorporated. He was one of three children, parents James Packer and Esther Greiner. They were married, but I guess she was progressive and didn't take his last name. By the time Alferd was 8 in 1850, Alfred's dad moved the family to LaGrange County, Indiana, where he worked as a cabinet maker. Alfred, being an unagreeable child, didn't have a great relationship with his parents, and he ended up going off on his own. As a teen, he moved to Minnesota, where he got a job as a shoemaker. On April 22nd, 1862, Alfred enlisted in the Union Army in Winona, Minnesota. This was American Civil War time. He only served 8 months. He was honorably discharged because of his epilepsy. He was having seizures. The next year, he enlisted again on June 25th, 1863, in Ottumwa, Iowa, only to be honorably discharged again because of his seizures. This time, he managed to last 10 months. After that, I guess he gave up on his military career. Packard was known to be a pain in the ass. Most people didn't like him or didn't trust him. They described him as argumentative, a pathological liar, and he was a known thief. After his failed Army career, he decided to go west. He tried to find a job that suited him. So over the next 9 years, he tried being a hunter, a wagon teamster, which I didn't know what that meant. I had to look that up. That was a person that drives animals around. So like steering a wagon that's driven by horses, for example. A ranch hand, field worker. His attitude and his epilepsy never allowed him to keep a job for too long. He tried being a guide, but he kept getting lost. Then he tried his hand in Colorado at mining. Again, not a good fit. He had no luck finding anything. So he moved on to the Utah Territory. There, he ran into a group of men led by a man named Bob McGrew. The group, like many Americans in the mid-1800s, were going to try their luck at striking gold in the Rocky Mountains. The 20 men, who were mostly strangers, were going to Breckenridge, which was in the Colorado Territory, where they heard tales of others striking it rich. The guys weren't crazy about bringing Alfred along. He had no money, no supplies, which if you were planning on participating in the gold rush, you were expected to bring your own supplies. And he didn't even have a rifle. He only had a pistol. But remember, he's a liar. So he sold himself on the story that he was a great guide and a prospector. And he knew the area that they were going like the back of his hand. So he sold these guys this tale, and the guys didn't know the area, so it's not like they could quiz him. In November 1873, Alfred joined the crew who left the Bingham copper mines from Salt Lake City, Utah, and they all started their journey. The guys in the group quickly grew annoyed with Alfred, specifically one man named Frank Miller. Him and Alfred immediately didn't care for each other. They were constantly arguing, but it wasn't just him who didn't care for Alfred. The others complained that he was eating all their food, he was constantly asking the guys for their stuff, and he was described as just overall lazy. On top of the fact that he was having seizures, he didn't even tell the guys about his condition, which would end up slowing down the trip. The guys were still trying to make their way to the gold. They were way behind schedule, and here comes winter. They're trying to follow the trail. But with the already fallen snow and snow still falling, they couldn't see anything. They had to travel solely relying on a compass. And remember, they're driving horse and carriages at this time. So travel was very difficult and the men ended up getting lost. This is when the guys saw that the guide that they brought with them was full of shit. The rations they brought were now practically non-existent. The 21 men started eating the horse feed, which I looked into what actually is in horse feed. It's oats and turnip powder, so I guess it wasn't that bad. And they were talking about eating the horses next. On January 21st, 1874, the group saw an encampment near Montrose, Colorado. The camp belonged to the Ute Native American tribe, which was led by Chief Orway, also known as White Man's Friend. The group was very hesitant about approaching the camp. They didn't know if the inhabitants would attack them, but they were desperate. It was either starve or try their luck at this encampment. But it was actually the Native Americans that were scared as these haggard-looking men approached them. Chief Orway welcomed the group with open arms. They offered the men food and a place to stay. This unbelievably gracious chief even said that the men could stay with them until the winter passed if they wanted to. The chief warned the men against crossing the San Juan mountain range due to the treacherous conditions. I mean, his tribe lived there for hundreds of years. Maybe they should have listened to him. The men did end up staying at that camp for a few weeks, trying to figure out what to do, trying to wait out the weather. But now it was February and they had a decision to make. They had to wait it out or go on. I picture the men with cartoon dollar signs in their eyes, and the allure of being rich was just too much of a temptation. But it was still snowing, and it hadn't slowed down since they found this camp. So half of the men decided to stay with the horses and wagons so they could catch up with the others when the weather finally allowed them to, probably in springtime. 11 men decided to trek on to the next outpost, which was Los Pinos Agency. Chief saw that he couldn't talk the men out of this impossible mission that they were going to go on. So he was like, all right, if you're going to go anyways, here's some food, and I'll give you directions so you can avoid the mountains, which is probably your best bet to get across. Alfred, the guide, managed to convince 5 others that they should go the more direct route through the mountains. 5 were going to go with the chief's idea of following the Gunnison River and avoiding the difficult mountains, and 5 were going to follow Alfred. So 11 at the camp, 5 following the chief's direction, and 5 following Alfred. The 5 that followed the chief's directions tried getting through the bad weather, but the snow and freezing temperature proving to be too much. They quickly ran out of food, and they were again in dire straits when a group of cowhands from the government cattle camp found them and offered them food and a place to stay, this time the men taking them up on their offer, and they ended up staying until April, like springtime. Now, Alfred's journey was different. He, along with the 5 men that he convinced to follow him, left for their 75-mile trek through the San Juan Mountains. In this group was Shannon Wilson Bell, James Humphrey, Frank, also known as the Butcher, Miller, George, California, Noon, and Israel Swan. The others brought them as far as they could on horseback, I'm assuming to like the base of the mountain, until they had to turn around. And Alfred and his crew started off on their own through the San Juan Mountains. They had just enough food for the 2-week planned journey. They were totally under-provisioned. They had the bare minimum. They had no snowshoes, no flint, a few matches, and they weren't dressed enough for the harsh weather and winter storms. And tool-wise, between all of them, they had a hatchet, a few knives, a pistol, and 2 rifles with the bare minimum of ammo. Exactly what happened next is still a mystery to this day. 2 months later, not weeks, 2 months, on April 16th, 1874, Alfred, in a disheveled state with rags tied to his feet, stumbled across a frozen lake, and he burst through the doors of Los Pinos Indian Agency. Inside, he found a group of employees at this outpost sitting around a table enjoying breakfast. His eyes widened, and Alfred begged for some food. The men welcomed him in, sat him down, and Alfred placed down his rifle, his knife, his steel coffee pot, and his bag. Alfred just started shoving food in his mouth as quick as it was presented to him, and he immediately started vomiting it up. The men thinking this was probably because of the time he went without eating, like a refeeding syndrome situation. Like your body will reject it if you go a period of undernutrition and then quickly eat a lot. He was able to get some whiskey down. Maybe this was what loosened him up enough to tell the group what happened. Alfred claims that he was hired to bring 5 guys through the mountains, and the weather caused him to go snowblind. He was struggling to keep up, and he fell behind the others. The others, seeing him as a burden, decided to desert him. So Israel Swan gave him a rifle and just abandoned poor Alfred. He told of how he ate plants to survive, eating roots and rosebuds, and he used his coffee pot with warm coals for warmth and sustenance. As the guys listened, their bullshit detectors started going off. Like, they've seen many lost travelers looking frail, malnourished. Alfred didn't look any of those. He, in fact, had a bloated face. Alfred told the men at the outpost that he had no money and he had to sell the rifle that Israel gave him, when he abandoned him. He sold the rifle to Major Downer for $10, which is the equivalent to almost $300 today. Alfred stayed at the outpost for about 10 days, and he was like, okay, I need to go home to Pennsylvania. Where can I get supplies? The men pointed him towards the nearby town of Saguche. I'm probably saying that wrong, sorry. There he rented a room at Dolan's Saloon, spending almost $100 there. He offered to lend the owner money if he needed it, $300. He went to the general store and spent $78. He hit up the bars in the area. He was a big spender. When he was drinking, he would get loose lips and tell all about his journey with all the still missing men. And the people of the town started to notice how his story would change a little bit every time he told it. And some of it just didn't quite add up. He was also said to have multiple wallets on him and just cash to burn. So new guy in town, spending a ton and telling crazy stories, word about him got around quick. Alfred was drinking at the saloon one day when in walks Preston Nutter and 2 other members of the original group, the ones that stayed with the chief. And Nutter was like, where is everybody? Alfred claimed that he got his feet wet and frozen, and he was setting up a fire, and the others went to go find food, and Swan left him a rifle, and then they just never came back. And he thought that he was abandoned and went on to say how he barely survived living off of plants and eating rosebuds and occasionally eating a squirrel if he happened upon one, which Nutter was not buying. Like, why would they abandon their guide? And Alfred did not look malnourished at all. And why would you leave a rifle with somebody if you're going out hunting? Nutter also noticed that Alfred had one of the men's knives. He was like, how did you get that? And Alfred was like, oh, he just stuck it in a tree and left it, so I took it. Nutter, not believing anything that Alfred was saying, started throwing accusations at him. It verbally escalated until a physical fight broke out. The men were pulled off of each other. At this same time, back at the outpost, 2 out of the 5 that followed the river made it into town, and they stopped at the agency. And then the other 3 arrived there a few days later. So the people at the agency, one being General Adams, were like, hey, one of your guys came through here. And the men were like, oh, cool. Who was it? And the man from the agency was like, oh, it was Alfred Packer, and went on to tell the men what poor Alfred had been through. He was just abandoned by his group. And all 5 men were like, no, those guys wouldn't do that. And they were like, by the way, Alfred's a slimeball. And that rifle that he claims that Israel gave to him was not Israel's to give. It belonged to an old man in the group. There was also a pipe that Alfred left behind at the agency that belonged to another person in the group. One of the men told General Adams and the others at the agency do not trust Alfred. They were like, no, something's off here, and they convinced one of the agency members to send one of their mounted officers named Charles Adams to bring Alfred in to get the real story. But they were trying to be smart about this, so they didn't want to flat out ask him what happened. Their plan was to get Alfred back under the guise that he was there to help search for the missing men. Agent Charles Adams arrived where Alfred was staying, and Alfred was already packing to take off. The guys from his crew in tow, which I'm sure wanted to wreck him. So Alfred's options were to get his ass beat or to go on the search party. He decided to choose the latter. So Alfred hopped on his brand new horse and followed the officer to the agency. While this was happening, Nutter had a quick word with one of the other officers. Once at the agency, Alfred saw the group that he hadn't seen since he was staying at the Native Americans camp. And General Adams from the agency was like, hey, thank you for your help on this. And then in walked an officer to General Adams and whispered something in his ear. And General Adams was like, I know when you first came in here, you were broke. You had to sell that gun. You got $10. But now I'm hearing that you spent hundreds of dollars in town. Like, what's good? The friendly conversation quickly turned into an interrogation. And Alfred was just repeating the same story over and over and over. And Alfred was just concerned and bewildered that these men from his party weren't back yet. And they were like, okay, like hypothetically, if we believed your story, where did you get all your money? And Alfred was like, oh, I got a loan from someone in Saguche, the town where he was staying. So they were like, okay, if that's the case, we could easily send someone there to verify this, make sure it all checks out, quick and easy. And Alfred hesitantly agreed. So the officer went into town where he talked to a bunch of people, and some said, yeah, I know him. His story always changed. Or, you mean Alfred, the guy with all the wallets? Or they were like, oh, that guy with all the cash? He came back with a lot of stories and info, but not one person in town is said to have loaned him anything. They decided to make a little court. They had some minors, they had General Adams, Alfred, and some officers. The hearings were about to start when 2 men from the Ute tribe just burst through the door. They were holding 2 dangling strips of meat, which they called white man's meat. They claimed that they found it near the agency while hunting. Alfred fainted upon seeing this. When he came to, he was like, "Please show me mercy. I'll admit to everything." And after he composed himself, he told Adams, quote, "It would not be the first time that people had obliged to eat each other when they were hungry." Alfred was bawling his eyes out as he's telling his story which would change many times over the next 30 years. The agency clerk, Herman Lauder, was there transcribing as Alfred spoke. Alfred said that they left the tribe's camp with 14 days' worth of food, but the difficulty traveling caused them to eat more than anticipated. So the guys started on roots, rosebuds, pine gum, a bunny if they got lucky. The weather, being their enemy, continued. There was no game to catch. It was roots or nothing. Then he described how the men started to eye each other in strange and unsettling ways, the hunger becoming unbearable. He claimed that one day he went to go get some firewood, and upon returning back to their camp, 4 men were savagely circling over the corpse of Israel Swan, who had been murdered with one blow to the head from a hatchet. The men started cutting into Swan, eating the most agreeable parts and packing some up for later. They took the few $1,000s that Swan had in his possession and split up the money, and Alfred took his rifle. They went through the flesh within 2 days, and still no game, no rabbits, no animals in sight. In secret talk, they decided that Miller would be the next to go, as he was said to be stockier. While Miller was bent over gathering wood, he received one blow to his head. In the same, he was cut up and eaten. Alfred then took Miller's knife, his money divvied up amongst the remaining men. As the snow continued and the days went on, they decided Humphreys was next, and then Noon, and then there were 2, Bell and Alfred. The 2 men were said to have made a pact not to eat each other. Each with a rifle and thousands of dollars, they figured they could survive on roots or on game, and they could finish their journey. They agreed on a story that the others died from the cold, and they agreed to take what happened to their graves, as no one would be able to understand the impossible position they were put in. The men kept trekking on, and the days kept passing. One day, they set up camp by a lake. Alfred claimed that Bell jumped up, and he said he couldn't take it anymore. One of them had to go so one could eat. Alfred said that Bell took his rifle and ran towards Alfred, trying to hit him in the head with the butt of the rifle. But Alfred managed to dodge it and swung his hatchet, hitting Bell in the head. He cut Bell up, eating as much as he could, and he packed up as much as he could, not knowing if he was going to make it until he saw Los Pinos Agency in the distance. Once he saw Salvation, he threw away the rest of Bell's flesh, thinking an animal or something would come and get it, even though he claims he was actually enjoying it now, especially the meat by the breast. Upon hearing this, one of the group's men started screaming at Alfred. They were like, "We're not buying what you're saying. Bell wouldn't have done this." They managed to restore order, but now they had to figure out what are they going to do about this. First, they were going to send a party out to go get the remains and give the guys a proper burial. General Adams, along with the Ute men, who knew the area, tried to find the places that Alfred had described. So the retrieval party started. Who was the guide? Alfred, of course. After 2 weeks, Alfred was like, "I guess I'm lost." One of the original crew was like, "Okay, let's just hang this liar right here." Nothing was found during this whole wild goose chase they went on, so they started to head back. On the way back, Alfred tried to kill one of the officers of the agency with a knife that he snuck on the trip. He was stopped by the men. Up until now, General Adams had given Alfred the benefit of the doubt, but now Alfred was arrested, and he was brought to the I keep saying this town wrong, I'm sorry. Saguche, and thrown into a jail outside of town to stop the vigilante justice, which I'm sure many wanted to enact. While sitting in jail, Alfred was like, "Oh yeah, that last story I said, I made that up." What actually happened was the snowfall caused a lot of us to get lost, and we ran out of food and matches, and we had to carry around a steel coffee pot with hot embers so we could make a fire. So we ate our shoes. We tried for roots. We couldn't really find any. There was no game anywhere. This is when Alfred signed his first confession story that started the same. The others killed the first 4 men, and he had nothing to do with any of it, and he only killed Bell out of self-defense. But his story changed every time he told it. It wasn't until the following August that the remains were found by an illustrator for Harper's Weekly named John Randolph. The remains found about 2 miles southwest of Lake City, Colorado, in a gulch, which is known now as Dead Man's Gulch. It's on the bank of Lake Fork of the Gunnison River. There laid the 5 bodies, all scarred with marks of butchery. The area matched the description where Alfred told stories of how him and Bell got into this last battle. Law enforcement was notified. They went out along with the coroner, and they saw the 5 men in various stages of decomposition. They did say that all the men had suffered extreme violence. Miller's head was just gone. His and Israel Swan's bodies were pretty much just skeletal. Noon and Humphrey's faces were untouched, but their midsections were flayed open and their legs were basically just bones. Bell being the least decomposed, so it's assumed he was the last to be killed, he had most of his body flayed. Bell's skull was open and his brains were said to be under him. The men all seemed to be missing flesh from the meatiest parts, and the 4 corpses with attached heads all had evidence of trauma, whether crushed skulls or hatchet markings in their skulls. This, of course, didn't match up to any of the stories that Alfred told. In his version, this one was killed here, a few miles later another one, but here they were all together in a gulch. In his claim of the murders being out of necessity for sustenance, discredited because a lot of these bodies still had plenty of meat on them to eat if you were starving. The theory was that Alfred was not desperate. He killed these men just to rob them. He thought that he could kill them, rob them, and take off. But he was snowed in, so he'd go to the bodies as needed in order to get nourishment. All the corpses finally got proper burials, and they headed off to the jail to go talk to Alfred, who was gone. The jail was a little log cabin on the sheriff's property, and the people in the town had been complaining because he had been jailed for months, and they didn't want to pay for the person to watch him. They didn't want to pay for his food. It was said that someone handed him a pick and some supplies and turned around. Alfred would never say who helped him escape. Whoever did maybe just didn't want the headache of him or of the town anymore. Or maybe he was offered some money to help him get out of town. The town already convicted him by public opinion. Even though the Donner Party was common knowledge at the time, having only happened 30 years prior, that was more out of desperation. And that didn't seem to be what was happening here. On March 11th, 1883, one of the original crew that stayed at Chief Orway's camp was approached in Douglas, Wyoming about buying some supplies. The man who approached him claimed his name was John Schwartz, but the man selling the supplies recognized the man as Alfred. And he reported this to the local sheriff, who scooped him up and got the message to General Adams. He was like, "I have your guy." And General Adams went and picked him up and brought him back to Colorado. Alfred telling General Adams that he only left because he was afraid of the vigilantes. Alfred again changed his story. Surprise. Claimed that Bell killed all the men and Bell tried to come after Alfred, and Alfred, scared, shot Bell through the belly and hit him with a hatchet over the head. The prosecution argued that this whole thing was planned out. Alfred wanted to lead them into a remote area, kill them, and rob them. The trial went on, and in the end, Alfred was found guilty of the premeditated murder of Israel Swan. All the other men appeared to be murdered in their sleep because of the cloth found embedded in their corpses. Either way, he was sentenced to be hung. He was convicted of killing the men and desecrating the bodies. He was not convicted of cannibalism because cannibalism in and itself was not illegal per se in the United States. A quote by the preceding judge, Alfred, "Be hung by the neck until you are dead, 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 and may God have mercy on your soul." So you would think Alfred was hung and it was over, but that's not the case. Alfred managed to avoid being hung. His lawyer found a technicality. In October 1885, the Colorado Supreme Court reversed his sentence under an ex post facto law, which retroactively changes the legal consequences based on when it was committed and the laws at that time. The government couldn't sentence a man to death for a crime that was committed before Colorado became a state. If you remember at the beginning, I said it was still a territory. This cleared him of the murder charge, but he still had to be tried for the men's deaths. A second trial started with a new judge. Alfred entered a plea of not guilty. This was a very quick trial. During the hearing, some hunters testified as witnesses that although the winter was terrible that year, there was plenty of accessible game in the area. Alfred, this time keeping his version similar to the second one, and still claimed that he was only responsible for Bell's murder. Alfred was found guilty of 5 counts of manslaughter, and he was sentenced to 40 years, which was the max allowed. This record-setting at the time is the longest sentence given in the U.S. history. Yay, Alfred. Alfred filed appeal after appeal, and every time he was denied. He tried getting sympathy through the media and ended up befriending Denver Post columnist Polly Pry, who launched a crusade on Packer's behalf. He was paroled by Colorado Governor Charles S. Thomas on February 8, 1901, serving only 18 years out of the 40. A newly freed man, Alfred, or the Colorado Cannibal, moved to Littleton, Colorado, where he was well liked by the community, and he was described as a model citizen, becoming a vegetarian. He developed dementia, and a stroke was cited as his cause of death on April 23, 1907. Alfred was buried at a cemetery in Littleton, Colorado, where his veteran's marked tombstone was paid for by the state. It was then stolen and replaced. They ended up cementing over his grave to deter grave robbers or vandals. While some claim his corpse is fully intact, Ripley's Believe It or Not Museum in San Antonio, Texas, claims to have his skull that they bought for $20,000. Many that visit the Littleton Cemetery claim to see his ghost or hear EVPs of Alfred. In 1989, the bodies of the victims were exhumed and the site was forensically analyzed, which ended in nothing. They weren't able to prove or disprove anything that Alfred claimed. Alfred is still a known name in Colorado. In Salt Lake City, there's a restaurant called the Cannibal Grill. The cafeteria at the University of Colorado is named after Alfred, as well as other restaurants. There's all kinds of menu items named after him. Also at the Colorado University, there's a statue honoring Packer. I don't get why they'd honor him. There's also a marker at the location where the murdered men were found, and it's all fenced in as a little memorial for the men. I'm sure most people are familiar with South Park. The creators decided to dabble in theater when they made Alfred Packer the musical, which I cannot imagine what happens in that, but I am intrigued enough to maybe watch it. I would love to hear what you guys think. Is cannibalism ever okay? Thank you, everybody, for listening. Bye.
Thank you for listening. If you need more content or just want to help support the podcast, head on over to patreon.com and search Ouch, Was That a Ghost? If you need some snazzy merch, you can find it at crowdmade.com by searching Ouch, Was That a Ghost? If you have a story you'd like to share, you can email it to ouchwasthataghost@yahoo.com. You can also find us on Facebook and all the other social media platforms under Ouch, Was That a Ghost?
Help me.
All links can also be found on ouchwasthataghost.com.